he raises is, how is it that at a time of unprecedented economic, scientific and technological progress, so many millions remain impoverished around the world? Meghnad has just written another book. I've lost track of how many. Have you?
Not yet finished. So
not yet finished, but he's working on a book called The Poverty of Political Economy. I'm sure you all know Meghnad for in many different guises. I first came across him as our external examiner when from the LSE, where he was Professor of Economics, and he's now Emeritus Professor. He joined the Labour Party in 1971 and then the House of Lords in 1991. And his research is extraordinary, though I probably know his work best on Dilip Kumar. His other great interest, of course, being Indian cinema.
My proud day was when I was your PhD examiner, remember? On Gujarati poetry, no less. I know her past.
Vicky Pryce is the Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research, London, and her book, Women versus Capitalism, is a call to reform capitalism, which she says systematically fails women. So we're looking forward to a lively discussion now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I hope this works. I'm not sure.
I'm sure it does. Ask them.
Does, you think? Does it work? No, it doesn't. Okay, so it doesn't.
Take this.
No. Does it work now? Yeah. I didn't press the on button. So it's as simple as that. I mean, we've just had a pretty harrowing session, so you might be able to cheer us up.
We will not torture the audience.
Yeah, but also just to say that, first of all, I'm absolutely delighted to have been asked to chair this. I do know Lord Desai reasonably well, at least I feel I've known him all my life. If you go into his Wikipedia entry, there is an interesting bit that says, in the 1970s, he taught an idiosyncratic version of economic principles to freshers at the LSE, but one of those was me. So it was quite unforgettable. And we have since, of course, worked together in other guises, if you like, including OMFIF, places where Lord Desai has been a chair. So it's great pleasure to listen to you. I think the way we'll do it is you'll say a few words, or perhaps more than a few words, and then we'll.
I will do what you say, Vicky, because as you know, I've always been very obedient.
Well, those of you who know Lord Desai may disagree, but there we go. So if you wouldn't mind then just talking about sort of humanity and how sort of economics has forgotten humanity possibly, or what do we need to do to get it back on track?
Now, you know, this book arose during the pandemic. I was confined to my house, and my grocery was being delivered, my medicines were being delivered. And obviously you read newspapers, and it is very interesting that when something like this happens, the people who are suffering are the same people. They're women, they're the elderly, they're immigrants. And you know, without fail, at every crisis, you don't have to do research on this. You know who is going to suffer. Then I thought, isn't it interesting that in the middle of all this, there are two demands, which is supposed to be sound economic policy. Sound economic policy is cut income taxes for the rich and cut benefits for the poor. Those are the two standard things. You see, when the stock market collapsed in 2008, money was no problem. Money got printed, thousands of millions of dollars got printed, bankers got saved, and rich people got saved, and all that. And then, of course, when it comes to, we must balance the budget. And when we balance the budget, we hit the poor. Now, given that that is sort of a standard thing, I thought, when did economics start believing in this? And when did this idea come that the rich deserve kindness and the poor deserve cruelty? And doing this because I had a huge library of books. I had all the books on on my shelf. And so I started investigating when in economic thinking this idea came up. And so the thing is a search for this thing. And it turns out that the idea is quite old in economics. It is what's called, the birth of political economy with David Ricardo and Thomas Robert Malthus after Adam Smith. Adam Smith is a good guy. In this story, Adam Smith is a good guy. But, and then I traced it to another phenomenon, which is that in those days, Parliament used to meet, but only 2% of the male adults had voting power. The franchise was confined to 2% of the population because you have to pay £100 of rates to be able to vote. And of course, everybody who voted was either a landlord or a very rich farmer. So Parliament, the House of Lords was full of serious hereditary lords, and the House of Commons was full of children of lords who would not be able to succeed because they were not the eldest son and things like that. Or the eldest son sat in the House of Commons till he succeeded. So the Parliament was made up of very rich people. And so Parliament was very conscious about taxation because the tax often fell on them. And so I traced the fact that, I'll explain that in a minute, that there used to be in those days an idea that every parish must, in England, every parish must look after all its people. There were able-bodied people who worked, who got a wage in agriculture, and there were people who could not work, who were called paupers. Paupers were people either with age or disability, or they were women or whatever it is, they couldn't work. They were maintained from the church rates. The church collected rates from the rich people, and they were paid. Now then there was an inflation in the last decade of the 19th century, of the 18th century. So the wages did not go up, so the church decided to support wages as well. That is the reason, and that is the stage at which Malthus starts complaining. Malthus says, if you pay the rich, if you pay the poor, they will only breed more children. He completely invented his theory of population. I can tell you, I have very carefully gone into it. The whole idea that population rises geometrically and food rises arithmetically is a complete invention for which he had absolutely no evidence. And what's more, while he lived, there was enough evidence to disprove what he said about population, and he never corrected that in any of the subsequent editions of his theory, essay on population. And his friend Ricardo, who was one of the most intelligent persons ever, incorporated that in the theory of value, as we call it, which is what determines value of something and so on. I'll explain that later on. But Ricardo was a very rich man, stockbroker, banker, and so on. And he, of course, held a lot of government debt and so on. So he was very conscious that the government must pay debt back. So he saw this idea that all property people should be looked after and not deprived. But the poor mustn't be paid because paying the poor is self-defeating because the poor are not responsible. So that's where the idea comes from. And that continued through the 19th century. Then when universal franchise came in the 20th century, that is when progressive economics starts. Because, it's a reversal of what Marx said. Politics is the basis of better economics. When the politics improves, economics improves. And that's what the book is about.
Doesn't it work the other way around as well, when economics improves in a way? So because people acquire slightly greater power, and that also moves to them becoming more politically aware.
When the House of Commons changes character, there are people who are trade unionists or other middle class intellectuals. The vote is extended to middle classes, then to the poorer people. During the First World War, you get male universal franchise, all male adults get, and then by 1928, women get full adult franchise. in Britain. So it took a bit of time till the early 20th century for universal franchise. And when universal franchise comes, the interests of the poorer people get discussed in Parliament, not before that.
Okay, but the two are linked. You don't have universal sort of franchise given if there isn't a sufficiently strong middle class or whatever who actually wants to be able to influence things more, who see the things. So I find it difficult to just divorce the two and say that somehow or other politics improves and therefore economics improves after, rather than it being the other way around. Because we had the Industrial Revolution, you had loads and loads of middle classes developing, with a lot of sort of merchants and also obviously manufacturing and exports and imports. So the whole thing, the whole structure of the economy changed. So you could, in fact, trace the political change to the economic change. So I'm just wondering about the way around that it came.
No, I mean, obviously, because of industrialization, villages become towns. Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, so on, they grow, and people move from countryside to the cities. Oliver Goldsmith wrote a very famous poem called the Abandoned Village or something like that. And the idea was that basically because the population changed, there was a demand by the middle class for franchise. And from 1832 and then 1860s and then 1880s, there were movements to extend the franchise. And those movements basically lowered the amount of money you had to be paying in rates to qualify as a voter. And there were the property qualifications. That property qualification slowly declined, and finally it was removed to get universal franchise for all the people. And then that didn't happen till the First World War. And so I trace, first of all, the economic thought, which established this ridiculous economic theory, but then how the politics, the growth of franchise came, and then finally how that growth of franchise improved the economics, discussion in economics about poverty, about redistribution, and things like that.
But you did say, Meghnad, that what you've still seen recently in the various crises we had, whether it was the financial crisis or COVID, that in fact, despite the sort of universal franchise thing that exists certainly in the UK, not so much in lots of other countries, you still have the interest of the middle class and the poor not really being listened to, even though the percentage of people who make it into Parliament who are from the upper classes, if you like, and the serious sort of property-owning classes, by which I mean bigger, is very small. So how do you explain that?
Yeah, I would say universal franchise is a necessary condition, but it may not be sufficient, because you need more than that, the participation in the political process of the people. I mean, imagine that lots and lots of communist countries had universal franchise, but they had no party competition. So there was no way people could affect policy. But here you have to have universal franchise and competing political parties. So competing political parties some parties would raise the idea of redistribution, and of course that would be a fight. So in a sense, it takes a combination of politics and economists thinking about redistribution and then getting into political influence to have redistribution possible.
Okay, so where are we now? Because you could argue that, of course, the UK is an example. Here we are covering, obviously, the Asian subcontinent or the Asian continent and India and so on. And also what happened, as we heard in the previous thing, much more widely than that, whether democracy even works, whether transparency works. And perhaps that comes back to, is it that people at the lower end of the income scale just don't have the knowledge to be able to influence what economic policies are there? Or do we just need to rethink what is best for the economy as a whole if we can rethink economics? In other words, getting people to become sort of richer, to become more empowered, you get better results, better productivity, better growth in the economy, etc., etc., etc. So are we not demonstrating that sufficiently in our economic models?
No, what I, this book is, written by an academic, but I'm trying to tell a story around this. What happens in the 20th century, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, is that the House of Commons gets more powerful than House of Lords. That's one thing happens. But then there is an economist in Cambridge, a man called Arthur Cecil Pigou, who is now not very well remembered. He is the first person to say that the goodness of an economy should be judged by the rate of poverty in the country. The lower the rate of poverty and higher the national income, that country is better than a country which is the other way around. So income share of the poor becomes a important variable. But then what happens very tragically, when he's writing in a second decade of the 20th century, suddenly another person in Cambridge and a friend of his, Keynes, comes and diverts the attention to full employment. And everybody forgets about redistribution. They think full employment is what we need for redistribution. So all discussion in economics, roughly from 1940 onwards, for the next 80 years, is about is Keynes right or not, inflation, Keynes, and all that. Everybody has forgotten Pigou. Everybody's forgotten about income inequality, poverty, and so on. Or rather, that becomes a minor topic in economics. Keynesian economics is the main thing. Now that Keynesian economics, in the 2008 crash, more or less all macroeconomic theories died. And we know, it doesn't matter whether Keynes or not, and Friedman. Nothing really is we know all that stuff. Well, now can we please train our attention to things like poverty, things like human development? And so my book says, okay, we don't need all that Keynes stuff anymore because despite full employment, we did not redistribute income. Now, if you're going to redistribute income, let us revalue, re-estimate what does the welfare of an economy consist of. And let's, what is value? What should we value in economics? And I have a chapter, last chapter, is basically how we must value lives and livelihoods. This is the kind of thing which comes out of the pandemic. What's important is lives and livelihoods. You have to protect people's lives in longevity, health, and all that, and livelihoods. Are they being able to meet their needs by the work they do? So it both needs sort of health and income distribution. So I finally think that economics ought to really value those things and measure the welfare of any society in terms of lives and livelihoods.
Well, the difficulty with that, of course, is that measurements are quite hard to come by. And one's welfare function can differ quite significantly from someone else's welfare function. Yeah. So that, of course, is quite nebulous for politicians. And when I was a civil servant, we were trying desperately, and now we're getting somewhere, to have a sort of well-being index.
Yeah.
But I mean, try and sell that well-being index to starving populations across the world, where what they really care about is having a job or at least being able to be fed. Yeah. So how relevant can we make it for them?
Well, I worked a lot on what's called the Human Development Index in the late 1990s, and that was promoted by the UN Development Program. And so, in a sense, people know that there are other ways of measuring the achievement of a country, and you compare countries and so on. Now I think, let me just go one step further and integrate health. They only have life expectancy, but I think life expectancy is not good enough. Because life expectancy, if I move from a country with low life expectancy to high life expectancy, my health doesn't improve. My longevity doesn't improve. So what I need to know for anybody, one measure is, of course, income. But other measure is how many years I've got to live. What is my remaining time of life? Because in a sense, while you're living, you can improve your position. Welfare depends upon being alive, more or less. So I say, let us measure the age structure and the longevity, the conditional longevity of people, and their income, per capita income. But per capita income is very misleading. Per capita income corrected by income inequality. So that gives you if income inequality is very high in a country, the average per capita income is not going to be everybody's income. So you have to modify income by saying, no, income by itself is not enough, modified by the degree of inequality the country has. Well, so you need to get some idea of how the ordinary person lives and how long is that ordinary person going to live.
Well, I think that's quite true. But if you look, for example, at and compare Scandinavian countries where there is very high income equality by comparison to others, with us, for example, and the US, where there is quite a big income inequality still, and if you compare it also, of course, with, I presume, India, very big income inequality, what you find is that GDP growth isn't necessarily affected by this inequality overall. So the average isn't particularly affected. But what it is, I mean, I don't know whether you agree with that. I think Paul Krugman had written that the US economist, that what happens is that you don't see this for some time, but after a while, this inequality is reflected in things like social tensions, and that has a negative impact on the perception of a country, for example. So you don't get foreign direct investment in, and it can, in the long term, have an impact. But going back to Keynes, you remember he famously also said, in the long run, we're all dead. So politicians don't necessarily care particularly about what may happen in the next or one after next political cycle. So do we have, as economists, more of a job to integrate all that?
Yes, of course. Basically, I think politicians think this originally, but basically they also rely on what economic wisdom there is. And if all economists say what I said to begin with, that cut income taxes and cut benefits, if that is economic wisdom, then we have to get out of that economic wisdom. And that is not the way to look at societies. Try and see what it is that will make people live longer and healthier life, and what will reduce inequality. Those are the two important things. Now, it is difficult to persuade people because the original idea is sort of 200 years old, that we ought to treat the poor badly because the poor only breed children, and whatever you give to the poor cancels out because there are more children. I mean, this is great, or they don't work or things like that. We have to get out of that and just say, no, let us say the poor and the rich more or less have same behavior, but let's give poor some more income than they have, and let us see what happens. It's not as if we have given them income and they have thrown it away. We just haven't given them income. Poverty still persists.
So would you give some advice to bring it to very topical issues of, right now in this Conservative government? We may have a Labour government later, of course. So what advice would you be giving to Sir Keir Starmer, for example?
Well, I would
and
say,
you probably do give advice.
I would say to this government that, rather than worrying about cutting income tax, why don't you worry about improving the health service? If you have money, don't give it away in income tax cuts to the rich. Save it and spend it on repairing the health system, because the health system has suffered very much in the pandemic, and we have done nothing to repair the missing money in that. And so there's no great rush to make the very rich better off. Let's not worry about that, and let's worry about basically improving the general standard of living, especially within which health is a very important sort of variable.
So your view is that way you're still going to get the economic growth that you need? I mean, I presume you're saying in a different way. We have borrowed an awful lot of money during COVID. Actually, interestingly enough, taxes have gone up for the norm for the average person quite significantly because of the stealth taxes that exist at present. When you're not raising your minimum income above which you start paying tax, then you get loads more people paying it, so the middle class is suffering, you have the energy cost increase. I mean, so it is a very difficult situation. Now, of course, we are in a privileged position, again, by comparison to loads of other countries whose health problems during COVID meant they had to borrow hugely as well, but the problem is that they can't really repay that very easily. So there's now this huge debate about how do these countries survive. Do we perhaps forgive their debt? Do we, how do you get the rest of the world? And of course, China has been involved in lending to loads of them and now extracts quite a lot of very high rates from them, isn't restructuring it, doesn't want to apparently. The rest of the world is looking at doing something. But the health service, as you rightly say, has been one of the main reasons why they needed all this extra cash, because they didn't have sufficient resources to either vaccinate their people or look after them. So what would you suggest is done differently? Of course, we need to invest a lot more in the health service, but what about transferring a lot of money too?
Let me give you one example, which people may be on the receiving side or on the gaining side, I don't know. And that is the whole idea of social care in this country. For a long time, we have debated how to provide for social care for the elderly. And it turns out that people are very reluctant in this country to tax capital gain from housing. They always say we can't ask the middle classes to as it were, sacrifice a bit of the wealth they have in terms of houses, because that's the only asset people have, and the middle class must not be allowed to do that. And of course, if you have a house and if you sell the house, there is no particular tax on it if it's your main residence. So in a sense, because we do that, we don't have enough money to provide for social care. And at that stage, the government decided to increase the national insurance contribution, which increased the rate of taxation for everybody. Now, so in order to protect the house-owning middle class's income, we have made all the poor pay more tax. Now, that's a perfect illustration of why it is that we are in this difficulty. And of course, another thing was what Rishi Sunak did. Having borrowed a lot of money, he did not index the income tax thresholds, so that as inflation proceeds, the less and less income-bearing people, they also get caught into the income tax net. Now, so these are known, as it were, instruments for catching the slightly poorer people into the net, just because you want to protect the richer people. And that is what it is. It's not that it's a poor country, but we are protecting some people's income in order to punish other people. Not to punish, but as well not to help other people.
Okay, so that's a damning assessment of where we are. So we should open it up and see.
My attack is more on the economics as a subject than on politics, because I think economists ought to stop saying what they have been saying, because that is not sound economics. Sound economics should be redistributive. That is my argument, and that requires good politics.
Yes, well, we've been hearing, of course, about so much corruption that exists in many states, in countries all across, and how a lot of the money which is created in the economy just is siphoned off elsewhere. Quite a lot of it in London, of course. As we know. So perhaps we'll open it up. I mean, suggestions on how we can change economics, that would be rather nice. So we can then go back and write the textbook that is going to win Nobel Prizes. So let's
Thank you, darling.
Yes.
It's working. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yes.
You
can sit down and talk.
The people in the back, okay, now that I've got up, it's better than I just want to ask you, now, did Brexit help the poor? Number one, did Brexit help the policy of Brexit, did it help the poor?
The poor, did it help the poor?
Policy of?
The poorer people, the poor.
Yeah.
No,
Second,
Would my policy help the poor?
Brexit, whether Brexit.
No, Brexit will not help either the poor or the rich.
and Modi's
there we are.
policies,
Sorry?
Modi's policies, Modi government,
Modi.
Modi government,
What about Modi?
His policies, are they helping the poor?
Modi government policies.
Well, in economic terms, it has been a success. there's a very big debate about poverty measurement in India and so on, but that measures poverty only in terms of do they have enough money for so many calories of food. But by and large, India's Human Development Index is improving, not as fast as we would like, but India, in a sense, India right now is, at least in terms of the measured GDP growth rate, is doing very well. Now, Modi government may have all sorts of other problems which I could go into, but then the night is young and I haven't enough time. But in terms of economy, the economy is not doing too badly. 6%, 7% growth is going on right now, and has been going on.
There is a big article in Politico today which shows how much India has benefited from buying cheap oil from Russia and then refining it and selling it. Part of the growth
I'm not in
is
favor
prosperity.
of India's foreign policy about Russia. I have said that in India.
No, in trade, yes, which helps the economy
I'm
of
on the
India.
Ukraine side.
Right, okay. Brexit then is safer. Right, yes. Over there, and then we'll get to
Who has
all
got the
questions.
mic? Whoever got the mic has got the right.
Thank you. What are your views on valuing environment and natural capital in economics, and what role can that play in balancing out the inequalities?
Because a lot of work is going on environment anyway, I did not touch on that because people are more or less agreed. My view on environment is that, everybody is very hopeful, but the world is not going to improve. For the very simple reason that if you look across the countries, we don't actually have a single global interest. We pretend that it is a global problem, the poor countries have very different needs than the rich countries. And in a sense, it's difficult to persuade the poor countries that they should expedite, going away from coal or whatever it is to better fuels. And this has been going on. The first time I heard in the early 1970s at a conference in Stockholm, 1 week to save the world. I waited for 60 years. So, because I think ultimately it's a fallacy to say it's a global interest. The income inequality among nations means that different countries have different interests in terms of environment versus growth. And that we saw in Glasgow, that China and India refused to go with coal, and they said, we're just not playing this game. Thank you very much. You do what you like. Now, between China and India, you got 2 billion people. And if those 2 billion people say, now that is a very difficult problem, even in economic theory. I won't go into that you cannot define a single welfare measure for an economy because the poor and the rich have different interests. It's the same problem again in redistribution. So I didn't go into environment because I thought, other people are doing that. And I've done work on environment, but not in this book.
But a lot of what is suggested, though, is in order to reconcile the different needs, is for huge redistribution to take place, not just within a country of the type you're talking about, but also between countries, so that there is a lot of money being transferred.
Yeah, for me, what I would say is that technology is changing, like electric vehicles. People's habits are being modified, not as fast as one would like, but we are not changing the prices of things sufficiently enough to be able to make our behavior environment friendly. We still are letting people waste the environment, very, 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 very much.
Well, I think one of the...
Travel is too cheap, for example. Travel should be much more expensive than it is.
Well, it's interesting you say that. There are two things, if I may. I mean, first of all, that during COVID, of course, and because of the energy crisis now, quite a lot of governments have intervened to reduce the cost of petrol for individuals. Also making transport free. So look at Germany, for example, has really encouraged people, admittedly, to use public transport, but a lot of that transport still uses fossil fuels, not all electric by any means. Yeah. So in order to ease the pressure, so we have these contradictory factors, sort of surviving the crisis versus the energy thing. But the fact that we've had this energy crisis has actually meant that there's been an acceleration, at least in many countries, of looking at alternative sources. So that's something that's got there. But the real underlying problem, I think what Meghnad was also probably hinting at, is that we don't charge for it properly. There isn't a proper carbon price, global carbon price. And without that, you're going to have all sorts of measures such as carbon border adjustments that the EU is doing, which are going to penalize countries that are just coming up.
But also water and solar power, wind and solar power. You know, India, for example, has done a lot of work on solar power. But, you know, we need to exploit those natural forces. Like wind and like now, for example, this country is making a mess of the wind things, you know, because people object to having wind turbines and all that sort of stuff. But I think if we can exploit the natural resources to replace fossil fuels and things like that, but you know, we know all that, but somehow we can't do it as rapidly as, because I think there are vested interests and they are not going to allow this thing to happen. So again, it comes to redistribution problem.
Well, I come originally from Greece, where solar power is being used a lot and wind up to a point, and there have been loads of days when it's been all new renewables. So until the summer comes and air conditioning comes on, then you sort of change a little bit. So I think there was another question there.
Yeah, please.
There's been a lot of talk about how we should consider taxing the super rich, 1%. And Oxfam has given examples of how even if you tax them 1% more, it would enhance the poverty situation across the world. And 99% of us think that this would be good for the world. So why isn't it happening?
But, you know, in a sense, politicians are also influenced by lobbying. You know, in politics, and the minority has more resources to lobby than the majority. It is, you know, for example, whenever a Labour government comes into power, it's always told, don't do anything drastic with the tax system because that will hurt your chances of re-election. When I was in the Labour Party for 49 years. I think that there is, besides universal franchise, there is uneven political power of money distributed. And I think that is a difficult thing that, for example, during the pandemic, the way the government had handled the PPE buying, it was a fantastic scandal. I mean, there were people robbing the public fisc of money by saying we will get PPE, and they have not been put in jail. You know, let's put it very simply. They have been disqualified from here, there, but you know, as well as people in a sense, what was called something about phone. You found out somebody was having a corona and told somebody else. There was a little program. I forget what it was. And I'm trying to remember the name of it. But it cost a huge amount of money. Some woman in the House of Lords, she set up all these people to...
Test and trace, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes.
What was it called?
Guido Harding. Test and trace.
Test and trace, yeah. Test and trace. Test and trace was immensely expensive. And so much money was made by people who were doing test and trace. I mean, it is a scandal beyond belief. And nothing has happened. You know, nobody has gone to jail. And if you cheat on your universal credit, you go to jail.
Or you don't pay your license fee, yes. And it's mostly women, unfortunately.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know.
One-
You're an expert on that, so you will know.
Indeed. But there is another issue about the if you like, the super rich.
Any more questions? Yeah,
So can I just ask you that, which is that, of course, a lot of the money is spread all across the world.
Yeah.
So and there is competition of which country can have the lowest tax rates. Still, even though there is now an agreement with the OECD to have at least a minimum tax rate of 15%, we still have Ireland at 12%, for example, and very little has changed. So the richer you are, just think of that. The easier it is to spread your money around different ways that cannot necessarily be, or is taxed in different ways, different jurisdictions. And we still have loads and loads of offshore finance centres.
Yeah. Well, you know, my view is that people have always got policies to attract foreign capital at low tax rate and so on. Now, I don't know whether if you attract all those people from abroad to start business in your country, who does it actually help? Who are you actually enhancing the income of? Should you not rather have a tax which gives you more revenue and then you can spend the revenue? Or are you kind of doing it for other reasons which will benefit more the richer people than I'm very suspicious about these low corporation tax policies and things like that. You know, I have never in my political life ever advocated a tax cut. No wonder I'm nowhere in the politics, but I've never in my living life done that. Because I think, you know, one really ought to think and rethink before you say a tax ought to be cut.
Well, Ireland would claim that they've done rather well out of this, and in fact, Dublin is now the most expensive place to live in because of all these people going there, apparently. So I'm told there was...
I do a lot of work on water resources globally and nationally and so on. One of the biggest problems we've been facing in the last 40 or 50 years on water and water management, as you know, water is the basis of life and economies and so on. One of the problems that we've always encountered is the fact that in charging and costing for water, externalities, so-called, are always dropped out. So I just wonder what sort of suggestions you might have on including these externalities in such a way that they can return them, and therefore some of the poor who are desperate and not able to grow crops and so on might be able to do so if those funds are channeled back. Is there a way of doing that? Is there some ideas behind that?
So what do you want me to do?
It's the externalities, water, the way that water is used and water companies involved, and whether we are calculating the loss of water, if you like, that is going on right now the right way in order to get something paid back to the poorer who need it most, if you price it properly.
Primarily the externalities of the charging systems.
I think I don't quite have an answer, but I think the way the UK water companies are behaving is absolutely scandalous. I would say that. But that is more to do with the way they're putting sewer into water and so on. But you want me to make water free or something?
No. Well, let's look at the.
That would be nice.
Let's look at the sewage system of the UK. Sewage treatment, where everybody complains desperately that the water companies are not fully treating the sewage, which is correct. They're not fully treating it. But the externality in that is that people dispose of things that they should not be disposing of into toilets. For example, wet wipes. Treatment systems were never designed for that. So this is an externality in the way that the charging system is in place. So my question is, how is it that you can stimulate through economics a way in which people will not misbehave in using nature, water in this case, and all the other natural resources that we have? Perhaps this is not the topic.
Obviously, you want to make waste disposal expensive unless you do it the right way. I mean, that is basically what you're saying. It's general environment tax on people's behavior. If people behave in such a way that they spoil the environment, and that is costing all of us money, therefore we ought to have a tax. We ought to invent a tax which is based on people's behavior regarding environmentally bad things.
That's what I mean by externality.
That's a good. I was thinking about how to develop a tax like that. I don't know that anybody will agree, but in a sense, yes, our behavior has to change in order for environment to improve. That's quite right, but you can only change behavior through prices. Prices or taxes, and I think you're quite right that we ought to change our behavior regarding waste disposal. But nobody has so far done it. Like Vicky said about carbon.
Well,
carbon
the problem
pricing.
is that those who manufacture things such as wet wipes, for example, are the ones who should not be producing wet wipes in the first place, of the kind that are not degradable. But people will use them. So there is a disconnect in the way that things are charged for in economics. While the polluter should pay correctly, the producer should also pay.
Polluter pays principle has been accepted, but we haven't had enough innovation in tax systems to make the polluters pay. I mean, the whole tragedy about the European carbon pricing is just, you promise carbon pricing at a international conference, then you go back and then you're told by your manufacturers, you do that and you lose employment, and then you pipe down and never do anything. So in a sense, carbon pricing has been a failure because nobody has had the courage to do carbon pricing properly.
So you partly do that through pricing, but also through regulation. So what we know is on the wet wipes, there is now regulation saying you're not supposed to be producing, you can't be producing the ones that have this particular element in it, which doesn't biodegrade, if you like, when you throw it in the loo. So that it doesn't happen. But yeah, there are all sorts of different ways of doing it. But there has been, of course, in a wider issue of water, there's the UN report saying that actually we're running out of water. And so that requires it even more, of course the wet wipes matter. But otherwise,
wasting away,
yes,
mismanaging it.
That's what they're saying. Yeah.
Sure.
Economics.
Yeah, but basically,
it's not just economics.
What you're saying is that water should be priced more.
Well, water should be priced, but the equity that's generated needs to be reinvested, and that's where the problem is, which is what my word externality meant. You make a charge for a service, but there's an unknown charge which you don't make, and that unknown bit is the one that fixes the problem.
Sure.
And as you said, there should be an environmental charge which is very unpopular, and it has to come into place.
Well, externalities work. I mean, this is how it works, as you rightly say, Meghnad, on carbon. I mean, so it's the same thing. It's an externality. It's not properly priced, but it's on everything we do. Yeah. The noise we make, the et cetera, that bothers other people. I was rung up by somebody who was writing something about pets, and is there a real externality there? Because we all have this, noise pollution, because he gets woken up every night by some dog next door. So it's a very strange way of thinking about all this. But yes, we absolutely do need to capture externalities, and economics doesn't really capture. We can't measure it always particularly well, and of course a lot of those externalities are longer term, and you've got to take that into account. There is a question there, I think.
I was talking about something similar to carbon pricing.
Oh right, okay.
Sorry, there's a question here.
Oh right, I'm so sorry.
Yes, that's okay.
Oh, that's where it's gone.
Dr. Desai, we have had for many years increasing income inequality in spite of the excellent work that you and many other economists like you have done. Are we at the threshold of a new rise in inequality as a result of new technological inventions such as ChatGPT and the fourth generation of artificial intelligence-related technologies, which will on the one hand enhance productivity, but on the other hand put that productivity at the service of a smaller and smaller elite who own these technologies?
Yeah, basically, as innovations have taken place, we've often feared rising inequality. For example, when computers were invented, there was a big discussion in the Indian House of Commons that they should be banned because if you have computers, there will be no clerical jobs left. But of course, that was not true. I'm saying, I know the chatbot panic is exactly the same thing. It is as if we don't have enough other things to do. For example, take caring. There's a huge shortage of labor in caring, right? That if people are made if people are made unemployed by chatbots, they could go do something else.
But they're very poorly paid for that.
Sorry?
So I think this inequality issue is an important one.
My question is specifically that these technologies will result in greater income inequality and wealth inequality because the technologies are owned by smaller and smaller numbers of people. So the computer revolution did not reduce necessarily the number of jobs, but it certainly created Bill Gates. And it certainly created the wealthiest people in the world who own these technologies.
But if there is an entrepreneur who invents something, he becomes rich. I'm not worried about single entrepreneurs. So single entrepreneurs deserve to be made rich. Bill Gates, I don't have any problem with. But what I'm saying is that when people have feared that an innovation is going to displace employment and make people poor, somehow other things have appeared, and we have because there are many things where there is a labor shortage, which we don't right now pay for because, I mean, in my calculus, we will spend much more money on taking care of people's health and betterment. That is where we ought to be investing much more money. And right now, it's a scandal how badly, at least in this country, the national health system has fallen. And I'm sure that we have a huge shortage of labor, more because of the Brexit and because a lot of people have left than anything else. But, in a sense, I'm not a pessimist about inventions. Income inequality existed before. It may have increased slightly, but, until about the 1970s, in the 20th century, income inequality was decreasing in developed countries. It's only after Mrs. Thatcher and people invented the market that we've gone the other way around. And so that can be recovered if we have political action to recover that. But I think inventions are good things. I'm not worried that the chatbot will get more smarter than me. I'm absolutely not worried. If I can invent a chatbot, I'm smarter than the chatbot, and I can outmaneuver the chatbot Anyway, so I'm not worried. Yes, I think some jobs will go, but it is not that there will not be other jobs to do.
Okay, we're running out of time. We're running out of time, and I'm sorry, but we have one more question there.
I'll ask a very quick one. I remember in the Soviet Union, I think, we had economic crimes and economic criminals. You talked about people not going to jail earlier. Is it time that the UK introduced economic crimes and jail time for economic crimes?
We probably have a lot of economic crimes on the paper. It's just that people are not pursued. For example, it's well known that the scheme that the then Chancellor, now the Prime Minister, had to compensate companies. A lot of completely fake companies were created. And I think the cost was £3 billion. We had a minister in the House of Lords, a Treasury minister, who resigned mid-sentence. He was answering a question on the floor. He said, I'm not doing this. Nobody is solving this problem, so I'm going. I think it's a huge scandal. We spent £3 billion on those things. And maybe half of that was worth it, but the other half was really, Treasury got cheated and did not take enough care. What happens? The rich get away with it and the poor don't. It's a very old story.
Could I just ask if, sorry, where are you pointing at? A question there. Question there?
Yes, I did have.
Yeah.
I mean, slightly going away from economics.
I'm sorry, we're going slightly over our time, so I hope you don't mind. Please, yes.
Yeah, very interesting lecture and enjoyed it. But I was just wondering, in 10 years' time, we'll be talking of the same thing again. So really speaking, what we need is a bit of spunk in the people for their own rights, to go on strike, get more money. For distribution of wealth, we need a bit more guts, like other countries, to have equality. Because 10 years' time, we'll be talking of the same thing again, and nothing will happen.
I'm talking about the whole world like this, you know. Yeah. My economics is not, you know,
so
in a sense.
Tangible thing that educate people a bit more, that they understand what Brexit and economics is about.
What is your question?
My question is that are we going to improve the situation in 10 years' time?
Well,
are we going to talk about the same?
No. My view is that it is not that the world is not improving, but we could improve the world better. So I don't think we'll talk about the same thing. But if we are, we might be at a slightly better stage of life, because by implementing some of these policies, things will change. Things just don't change fast enough, because our interests are not common. Our interests are not the same. Because we live in an unequal society, our interests are not the same.
I'm just trying to decide whether we've ended up with an optimistic or a pessimistic note. I'm choosing to interpret it optimistically. So thank you, Meghnad Desai, Lord Desai, very much indeed for this.
Thank you. And I'm very sorry to people who couldn't ask